Thank you all for coming tonight to our fourth in the series for our first inaugural master class, and we appreciate you coming. The goal of these classes was to stimulate discussion, and this first series on teaching and learning, my job is to talk about the teaching, Mary Helen's talking about the learning, and then our last session on November 28th, we'll come together and talk about teaching and learning together. Although, of course, it's not possible to really talk about teaching without talking about learning. Right? I would say that good teaching is like good cooking. It's the eaters who decide if it was good, right? Not the cook. And so with that in mind, I want to talk about, first acknowledge, I'm doing this not because I think I'm a master teacher. I've been teaching for over 40 years now, and I believe that it still requires ongoing work. It's a craft. It's not something you perfect. It's not something that you can say that because you've done it for a long time, you've got it figured out. That's part of what makes it so, I think, rewarding, is that it's creative work, right? And figuring out how to do it requires a lot of thought and hopefully reflection on what we're doing. So with that in mind, I want to start by saying that a lot of my own thinking about teaching has been with these two goals in mind. How to use teaching as a strategy to empower those that you're learning, and I'll talk more in a moment about what that means, and to disrupt things that aren't working, particularly the status quo, to use a pretty general point. And the reason why I think both are important is because the society we live in, the world we know, is not sustainable. Not sustainable on so many ways. Not sustainable from an environmental standpoint, from an equity standpoint, from a justice standpoint. Education is one of the few resources we have. That was part of the point I tried to make in the first class, that for trying to create a different world, but what the evidence shows is that it's more likely to reproduce patterns of privilege and disadvantage. Strongest predictor for how well our students do in school, again reflected in the NAEP scores, which are the big education news today, along with the school shooting in St. Louis, show the disparities that correspond to race and class throughout this country. And beyond reinforcing inequity, education also reinforces mindsets about the way the world works. And the tendency is to think that if we prepare our students for good jobs, we've done our job, when in fact, our students need more than that, if they're going to use education to transform society and the world. The other problem is that many of us, if not most, have been led to believe that some people are inherently smarter than others. And I spent the weekend with an old friend who's a math teacher who's been spending most of his career trying to fight that, because there's this idea out there that some people are inherently good at math and many others are not. And that's part of the reason why over half the population fears math, hates math, wants to avoid it as much as possible. Now, some of that we can attribute to the way it's taught, but I think a lot of it is to the way we think about intelligence. We think some people have it, some people are gifted, therefore we have gifted classes, and then some are, therefore, by extension, giftless. Not as smart, not as capable. And with that mindset, we are not troubled when we see patterns of inequity in outcomes that correspond to the backgrounds of our students. So the last point I'll make here, and this is true, I think, especially at the university level, but it's true even in secondary schools, is we often see teaching and learning as disconnected activities. I teach, you learn. You don't learn, not my problem. I'll grade you. And that disconnect, I think, results in very often us missing the power of education and teachers themselves being much more influential than they could be. So I want to talk about how we get back to that. So the question I'm looking at today is, what kind of teacher can facilitate the disruption of the reproduction of inequality that I just described, to empower, promote opportunity, empathy, equity, and justice? Those are at least the goals that I have in mind. And I think to get to those goals, we have to have a sense of what it's going to take to get there. So one of the things I think that if we're going to change society, we have to produce a generation of people who are creative, who are not simply trying to fit in, but who are thinking about how to change things, drawing on their imagination, drawing on their abilities to solve problems, to create something new, something different. If we can't do that, then we're really screwed. Because the knowledge we have gotten us to where we are. So if all we do is prepare students with that knowledge in mind, then we just keep repeating the same things. So how do we unleash more creativity? How do we get people thinking critically? Especially now, because all of us, by virtue of having cell phones, have access to so much information and therefore are so easily manipulated. How many of you know people who've spread misinformation to family and friends about vaccines or about politics or about any number of other things? In part because they don't know what's a good source, what's reliable, what's not. And that leads to more manipulation, more mind control. Empathy and compassion. I would say we're at a critical point here, because increasingly, if we are not experiencing a problem, we're almost led to believe that problem is not ours. You know, I always say that New York made me mean, because just getting down the sidewalks makes you mean in New York after a while. LA makes you callous, because you are exposed to so much suffering on the streets that after a while that starts to seem normal. But is it normal for a civilized nation, a wealthy nation, to have so many people living on our streets? And where does empathy take us in terms of solving problems, whether it be homelessness, mass incarceration, you name it, if you don't believe that problem is also yours? To what degree does education cultivate empathy, compassion, problem-solving skills, ethics and social responsibility, basic sense of right or wrong? How does that fit into what we're doing? And not just for small children, but for adults. I'll come back to that. And then how do we use education to counter things like racial injustice, sexism, and other forms of bias and hatred? And again, to empower, so that we don't just feel bad about these things, but we have a sense we have to do something about them. All real important if we're going to change the world we're in. So part of what I think we have to do is we have to rethink the goals of teaching. Many of us were led to believe, especially those of us who've taught, that the primary goal is to impart knowledge and information. Therefore, we have a syllabus, we have to cover content, we have to make sure our students are exposed, they do the readings, they hopefully gain some understanding. And if they gain a higher level of understanding, then we think we're actually doing something really good. If they're able to process information, to reason, to apply it, right? That higher order thinking. And as again, the NAEP scores remind us, part of what we need is evidence that they've learned. And increasingly, unfortunately, in schools, it's teaching to tests that ultimately is the evidence we use to determine whether or not students have learned. It'll be interesting to see the fallout. What do we do about the NAEP results? We knew the pandemic took a toll on kids, especially who were denied learning opportunities because they were isolated. So really the results from these scores just tell us what we kind of expected. The real question is, what do we do about it? How do we respond? And that'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because it'll tell us a lot about where we're going with respect to education over the next few years. How do we create space for more than these goals, to do some of the things I just described? Create a space for creativity, for empathy, for justice, as a part of teaching. So I want to stop for a moment to pose this question to you. When you think of your most powerful learning experiences, what was the teacher doing? What was the teacher doing when you said, wow, that was amazing, that was inspiring, that turned me on. Has anybody ever had an experience like that? Yes. What was it? What happened? Okay, all right. So it was outside, but that kind of sparked your interest. Very good. Anybody else? What made that so powerful for you? Okay. So it revealed a lot. Oh, I'm sorry. But next time, one more hand. Powerful learning experience that you can recall that really, yes, Terry.
In third grade, mic's not working, but in third grade, I had a teacher, Miss Prophet, and for the math activity, we always used to play around the world. So for me, it was powerful because it was competitive, and she always knew that the students loved it because the energy would change. So that was a really memorable moment, and it was my exposure in love for math started at that grade.
Okay. So again, it was the competition worked. So the reason why I asked that is because I think that how often do students come at the end of the day and tell their parents, wow, what a day. That was amazing. What happened today? We learned such amazing things. Unfortunately, I don't think it happens nearly enough. And I think it could happen a lot more, not just for younger students, but for older students as well. So look at this classroom. I saw it happening there. This is Hollenbeck Middle School in East LA. It's a 90-minute math class. And the kids are up out of their seats talking about a problem. They were asked to design a home. They had the dimensions, and they had to figure out how much supplies, how much cement, how much drywall to order. So they were applying what they'd learned in the algebra class to this project. Teacher's so good in the back, she could talk to me. She's not hovering, because the kids are empowered to run it. And what struck me is because she teaches that way, she's basically relinquishing her power to them. She's now the facilitator. She's moving among them. Right? And as I watched and observed and listened, I said, why do you teach like this? She said, because this is how they learn. They learn through interaction. And what's more, it's the best approach to classroom management I've ever used. Because when they're engaged like this, I have no problem with distractions or disruptions. And she said the key to making it work is knowing my students. Knowing who should work with who can help who, building a learning community. And that's exactly what, so what she was doing was focusing on engagement. Now I'm cutting into Mary Helen's task, right, which is a multi-dimensional phenomena. It's behavioral, they're on task, that's the part we can see, but it's also cognitive. They're processing, they're making sense of things. They're applying what they've learned. And very importantly, it's emotional. They actually care about what they're doing. They cared so much that when the bell rang, they were interrupted. They were disrupted. They weren't packing up early. It was a powerful learning experience. And it was interesting because I talked to one of the kids in the class. I said, wow, this is amazing. He said, oh, but she's not the best. I said, really? I said, who's the best? She said, this other teacher. I said, well, I got to go see him. I go to his class. He has a drum set at the front of the room. I'm like, what's he doing with the drums? And he's doing call and response on the drums all period. And the kids, it's a cutting class to be in his class. And the sad thing is that while I could find these teachers doing these things that got kids deeply engaged, in many cases they were right next door to people who were doing the same thing, talking at kids, because they were teaching in isolation. So Bell Hooks, who passed away during the pandemic, says this about community building. She says, as a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence. That's what was happening here. They have a learning community. Because you can't do that if kids can't respect each other, if can't listen to each other, if they can't disagree respectfully. But learning communities aren't limited to the classroom. They could be the whole faculty. Right? Because when the adults learn to work together respectfully, schools become more powerful, universities become more powerful, because now it's many people working for common goals. But it's not just something you achieve, right? It's something that you continue to work at. So Paulo Freire, who obviously wrote a lot about this, describes this as what he called problem-posing education. And he said it needed to be focused on problems because it's problems that animate us. It's problems that give us that sense of urgency and purpose. Right? That's pretty much what you described, the problem that the teacher created, even though it was artificial. Right? It says it relies on dialogue, because we can't figure this out if we just talk at each other. And it disrupts the traditional powers. It disrupts the teacher's power because the teacher's no longer the authority. Because the real problem is one that the teacher doesn't have the answer to either. In many ways to think about the problem. He says, in problem-posing education, people develop their power to perceive critically the way they exist in the world with and in which they find themselves. They come to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality in process, in transformation. Imagine what would happen is if instead of seeing things the way they are, we said, why should it be that way? Why should people be living on our streets? Why should we accept current conditions? How could we do it differently? Well, I have a former student at Berkeley. She started this center, the Center for Cities and Schools, and that's what they do. They take students, they go into schools, they started in Oakland, and now they're global. And the kids are the ones who generate the problem. And the problem becomes the basis for a curriculum and for a course of study, how to understand that problem, how to approach solving that problem. Some of the problems are small, litter on the street. Some of them are big, violence. What's interesting and profound about this is that it changes the way the kids or the students feel about themselves in relation to that problem. They no longer feel powerless. They actually have clarity about what they can do, which I think starts to change lots of things. I think that when you can empower people, then even problems that seem overwhelming start to seem like something we could do something about. So a few years ago, 2012, I believe, was the first Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And immediately we said it's going to be a pandemic, and the response was quarantine. Don't let anybody from those three West African countries, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and I forget the Ivory Coast, or I think it was Ivory Coast. Don't let them out. Don't let them in. They even had a nurse that flew into Newark. Governor Christie put her in a tent at Newark Airport, said she's not allowed to leave the airport. But while Western governments were quarantining these 3 countries, some people said, we can't, that's the wrong thing. We have to go there. And we have to show people how to deal with this illness. And he said, the key is trust. He says, if people don't trust you, they can hide the body and you'll never know. And Ebola will keep spreading. They've got to trust you, but we don't have that kind of time. He was an epidemiologist at MIT, but he was Liberian. So we went back to the same community where the outbreak, the kind of epicenter, a neighborhood called West Point in Monrovia, and he started showing and teaching people, this is what you got to do when someone is sick. So this was another kind of education, but not in a classroom. This was in the community, and the stakes high. And although they did not have an advanced public health system, they stopped Ebola. You know, we don't celebrate victories like this, but we should. And we should learn from them, shouldn't we? Because too often we're led to believe it's going to take experts to save us. It's going to take rich men like Elon Musk. Remember this, when this was happening? These boys were stuck in the cave in Thailand for 19 days. Elon Musk said he'll send robots in to save them. It was divers who had to navigate almost 2 miles of cave underwater to get to those boys and then get them out by drugging them, because they wanted to panic to get them out of the caves. They got them all out. When they got out, the divers were the heroes, and they certainly were heroic. But the boys all said it was their teacher who saved them. The teacher, who was 24 years old, had them meditating the whole time. So they didn't panic, because they were in pitch black dark. No food, no water, 19 days. Well, 13 days. They started getting them food after the 13th day. He insisted he'd be the last one out. Turned out he was a monk before he became a teacher. So he had experience. But in the midst of a crisis, he showed that you could actually do something to keep people safe. My point here is that education happens in lots of settings. And sometimes it's in those alternative settings that it's even more powerful. So a few years ago, I visited Robben Island. Robben Island is the former maximum security prison just off of Cape Town in South Africa, created by the apartheid government to destroy the liberation movements. And when I went to visit, I was given a tour by a former prisoner, a person who had been incarcerated there. He said he did time with Mandela and the other leaders of the ANC. He said they created this prison to destroy us, and it became known as our university. I said, the prison became your university? He said, yeah, I came in, I had almost no education. He said, we learned from people like Mandela. We learned from people like Oliver Tambo. We learned from Dennis Brutus, a poet. They taught us. I said, how'd they teach you? He said, well, we got guards to smuggle in material. I said, the same Afrikaner guards? He said, yeah, Mandela befriended the guards. This guy, his family was being evicted. Mandela was a lawyer. Counseled him on how to fight the eviction. And as a result of that lawyerly relationship, he became an ally. He turned someone who was there to imprison and punish into an ally that helped in ultimately liberation. So teaching can be powerful even outside of classrooms. I was trying to explain this to my son, who was debating with him over the weekend. I was saying, all the organizing movements of the 70s and the 80s focused not just on trying to mobilize people, but to teach them about the issues. For the longest time, What made the great boycott successful in California was not that the farm workers were so powerful. It was the fact that at every Safeway across California, there were people saying, don't eat grapes. Because they knew that farm workers alone could not stop the growers. It had to be the people who eat grapes who side with them and say, yeah, we're not going to eat grapes until you treat them right. So teaching comes in lots of different forms. And when it comes with a strong sense of community, then even what seems impossible becomes attainable. So when I was in New York City, I was at an event, and this woman comes to me and she says, I want you to come to my school in the Bronx and meet the Noguera babies. I said, Noguera babies? I don't have any babies in the Bronx. She said, oh, yes, you do. I have a whole school full of them. So I get to her school, and she says they have a Frida Kahlo group, there's a Pedro Noguera group. I said, I didn't even know. She said, yeah, this group's named after you. They serve students with interrupted formal education. That means they did not attend school regularly in their native country. They don't speak English, and they're not literate in Spanish. Most of these kids were from the Dominican Republic. Within 6 years, not only are they fluent in English, they pass all the state exams in English. Math, science, so that 95% of them go to college. I was like, this is incredible. How could you get results at a school like this? All these kids are very poor. So they meet the, just kind of demographically, these are the kinds of kids that should be dropping out of school. But they're not. So I asked the kids, why is a school like this so, what makes it so powerful? They said, well, it's like a family. We look out for each other. We help each other. We even help our teachers. I met with some teachers. They're planning lessons together. Planning lessons together, they said every lesson is planned collectively. Collectively. No one gets to go out with a lesson unless it's been looked at by their colleagues. The new teacher returns to me, don't all teachers teach like this? I said, no, they don't. He says, well, I'm so glad because I don't know what I'm doing. And if I went out there by myself, I would really be at a loss. I share these examples because these kids are undocumented. They have no reason to hope in this country that there'll be any opportunity. But they're in a school that does give them a sense of hope and possibility. They're finding ways to work within the constraints to use education to transform lives, and a lot of it has to do with how they teach and how they learn. And so when you see examples like these, we're reminded, yeah, agency, right, that ability of human beings to transform their reality despite incredible obstacles is part of the human experience. They just did a documentary recently on the life of Harriet Tubman. And I just can't say enough about her. This woman was not even 5 feet tall, illiterate, freed more people single-handedly than anyone else during slavery in this country. Later in her life, when they asked how you managed to do this, she said, I could have freed more had they not been afraid. She said she learned to read the stars so she could figure out which direction was north. She cross-dressed, dressed like a man so she could be a spy. Ended up becoming a spy for the Union Army. We have many examples like this that we don't sufficiently learn from. And I think if we knew more about the power of education, we would know more about how to use it to make different decisions. So I want to close with this because when I first read this, I was on the board of Facing History and Ourselves. I was struck by how profound it was. From a survivor of a concentration camp, Chaim Guignot, and he says, I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no person should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. I'm suspicious of education. My request is help your students to become more human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths or educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human. That, I believe, is part of this goal that we're after. And I believe as we pursue that goal, that we can, in fact, use education as a resource for advancing our common humanity. I'm going to turn it over to Corey Street, who, from the Shoah Foundation, who's agreed to come and make some remarks, and then we'll open it up to you.
Wow, it's a hard act to follow, so what do you say we all just go get some cookies? I'm so thankful, Pedro, and to Mary Helen, not only for inviting me here to talk to you all, but just for having this conversation. I hang out over at the top of Levy Library, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how we do many of the kinds of things that you're talking about. And I think what's just so powerful is right now is the question of, because you've done a beautiful job of saying why and what we have to do, we think a lot about how, right? How do we do this? Because we're looking at an educational system that is trying to repair out of the pandemic, was already, underfinanced. Teachers are under enormous stress. Their students are under stress. I mean, I think one of the things that this education school has done so beautifully over the years is to really think about different ways of getting students what they need in order so that they can learn. But when we go out into the field and we talk to teachers, it's like, well, even if you don't have a family and you got to do those things, how do you have the time to meet with all of your colleagues and do that? And that might be the best practice, but can you do it all the time and still have a life when you're making the kinds of choices that you have to make and to be a teacher? Deal with the educational debt, deal with those kids who are leaving, deal with, I was so blown away by what Mary Helen was saying at the last discussion about how you have to figure out that person, and you have to find the way and find their story. And so a lot of what we do is we think about story. We think about what stories and how stories can connect us. And that's, I think, what Bell Hooks is talking about. Bell Hooks and others are talking about what's the story. And I think, Pedro, you did a beautiful job of sharing stories that connect us, right? What's your moment? I think when you asked the question about what's that most dynamic moment that your teacher, you went home and said, wow, what a great day. And then my history teacher kicked me out of class. Right? Because he knew I was struggling, he cared about me. Right? And that was opened me up to wanting to be a historian. I got a PhD in history because I was kicked out of class in grade 10 because I was tired, because I was sick. Right? So a teacher actually looked at me and said, you don't belong here today. How do we make sure you've got what you need? Come back tomorrow. And then he taught me how to do all this other stuff, which was very interesting, but not as important as that teaching moment where I realized that a teacher could care. Right? But again, it's how do you do that day in and day out? What are the resources that are available to you? And I loved that checklist. I wrote all the creativity, the critical thinking, the empathy, because these are the things that over where I'm at from the USC Shoah Foundation. And if people on campus have heard about it, they think, oh, that's the Steven Spielberg place. That's the archive of all sorts of people like this. Right? So what we do is all about the Holocaust or all about genocide. And we have 55,000 human stories. Stories from people who certainly have seen the worst of life and the worst of history. Most of our collection is of the Holocaust, the genocide against the Jews. But we also have stories from Rwanda, from Armenia, from Darfur, from Uyghurs, from people who are struggling today, from the indigenous cultures of Guatemala. But there are other archives on campus that are bringing in other stories. Anti-Black racism, we're talking to indigenous groups about all over the world about how they bring in their stories, because these stories are ways that can connect. And when we look at how that goes in the classroom, the easy thing is, well, yes, we can do Holocaust history or genocide history. But what we're doing that's so disruptive these days is we're making easily accessible activities with story at the heart that can be used across curriculum, across grades. And I want to tell you a couple of stories about, student experience of this that kind of drive it home. I want to tell you about a student that I had the privilege of meeting just after I started here. We were doing our 20th anniversary of the Institute. I've been here for about 10 years. We're heading into our 30th anniversary in about another year here. And somebody said to us, give us an activity that gives student creativity. So we looked up to Stanford, and they have this innovation challenge where students have to make value out of an object. And they have 10 days to do it. So it's creativity, it's innovation. So we took that and we made it about social responsibility. So we said, go out into your community, find what you can do to make a difference. And we asked them to be inspired by one of the testimonies in the archive. And so then they went out, they could work in teams, they could talk to each other, but it was all about activating their thinking, activating their engagement. And there was a student, and it's one of those kids, comes from a family of undocumented immigrants in a major city, and was at a school that was 98% African American or Latinx, and had decided by grade 9 that high school wasn't for her. By grade 9. When I met her, I was there to tell her that she was a regional finalist, that she was one of 5 students across the country who is, in for the final round. And the whole time, she stood behind me. So we're in a theater, her whole school's turned out, and to hear this announcement, and the whole time she's standing behind me and she's whispering. And so her activity, the eyewitness challenge that she did, what she did is she listened to a story by a guy named Leo Fettman. And he talks about his family being given 20 minutes to pack a bag and get out of their apartment. And they were deported. And for this student, that had happened to her family, because at the time, ICE was very active in their community. So she had lost family members. People in the school had lost family members. Kids had been left. So there are all of these concerns that are like every day for her. Now again, she's quitting high school. She doesn't see herself having a future in this major city. And so she did some research, and she found out that there was an organization helping immigrants, but also advocating for changes to policy. And at the time in Philadelphia, the police worked very closely with ICE. And so one of the big pushes for this advocacy group was to disassociate, was to make that separate. And so this student, ultimately, her film won. So she created a film. She created social value in her school. But what was really important is when she came to our gala, she got to meet President Obama. And he watched her film, and she said to him, in a fully voice, not a whisper, you need to do better. Right? Philadelphia changed policy, not because of her, but she rallied her whole class to go out. They made signs. She became an activist. But what was really important is she got a scholarship to Temple University. She went from having a grade 4 reading to having an above average reading. She got engaged in school. Right? So for all of those other kinds of things, and it was one activity. Right? We had another teacher down close to the border who always got the class with the kids who were, just as you talked about, those kids in the Bronx. English wasn't their first language. Illegal. Really struggling to understand. And this teacher showed them 3 to 5 minutes of testimony at the beginning of every class. So seeing them twice a week, beginning of every class, they watch a testimony from someone from our 55,000. So they learned about people from Poland and Germany. Their world opened up. They learned from people in Guatemala. They learned from people all over the world. And their English language scores went up amazingly. By the time they came up to see us, most of them could converse. Some of them were really developed their English skills, but they developed their confidence. Right? So they looked at learning about other people, developing empathy, becoming more human, right? And so we have 500 of those activities, kindergarten right through adult learning, that can help teachers. Because even when you have the skills, you have the dispositions, you're asking the right questions, you've got great leaders that are helping you think about how we can do this better, you still need a community, you still need resources, and you still need support, right? And I think that's one of the biggest things we all have to think about is how do we support. How do we start to, get out there and help making this all accessible? So what, time is saying is incredibly important, but there's ways to access stories. Not only the stories in our archive, but your story, their story. They come with knowledge. Using those stories can help build that empathy. It can help them be more critical thinkers. So what we do is we see students who, when they see, banners over the 405 saying, "Yeah, is right, Hitler was right," right? When we see anti-Semitism and other kinds of hatred going up, we're building students who realize that they need to have empathy for people, even if they don't know them and they disagree with them. They need to be respectful. They need to also know how to react to that, how to respond to that. And if we can teach them that and help them to develop those skills and dispositions, then we're going a long way to making them human. So even when they do have those experiences, or they have the experience where it's not a very engaging class, they are engaged elsewhere. So, I mean, I thought today was just wonderful and brilliant. I think, I'm looking forward to hearing the questions that you all have. But if you're ever over in Levy Library, 4th floor, come on up.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thanks.
So let's, ooh, that was loud. Let's open it up. I don't know how much time we have, online and in person. Brandisha.
I would like to imagine a future where assessments are actually based on creativity. And, Black students often are some of the most novel, creative thinkers, I've ever taught. And I'm just wondering if we imagined a future, or if there was a future where there wasn't this biased NAEP test, what would we have to do right now to get to that future where assessments are actually based on creativity?
Really good question. It's something I thought a lot about. In fact, I'm going to be on KPCC tomorrow morning talking about this. So, I think, so the way I start from the premise that assessments are necessary because you need to know where a person is. But it's totally useless if all you do with that is rank a person, right? It'd be like going to the doctor, they run tests on you, and they just tell you, you're sick. You say, okay, now what, doc? I say, well, that's what we do here. You're sick. Not good enough. Real question is, how do we get well? And I think similarly for our students, if we just use testing to rank people, what we're totally overlooking is their strengths, their talents, and their abilities. So we have to have a different way, a more holistic way of doing that, that does allow us to get different information. I had an experience working with Hawkins High School here in LA, and it's a class, new teacher, 35 kids, and none of them speak English. He's trying helplessly to try to teach them English. And so finally I turned to him and said, what are you doing? He said, I'm trying to teach these kids English. I said, it's not working. He said, no. I said, what do you know about these kids? He said, I just know they don't speak English. I said, what else do you know? He said, that's all I know. I said, do you know that these kids, many of them crossed many borders to get here? These kids have incredible resilience. They're resourceful. I said, you're teaching brilliant kids. He said, really? He said, no one told me. I think part of what we have to do is tell the educators, don't judge kids by what they can't do. You have to learn more about what they actually can do, how they use knowledge when they're not with us. We have kids who are problem solving, who are resourceful, who are demonstrating resilience in other parts of their lives, and none of that is seen in schools. So I think part of recognizing their humanity is seeing that. And then the whole process of education starts to look different. But so much of the work has to happen with the educators so that we move away from the mindset that the only thing that matters is what's going to be assessed and not really who they are and how they're using knowledge right now. What do others think? Anybody online? Not yet. How about anybody that's teaching right now? Well, aside from our faculty in the K-12 schools. Because a lot of times, I don't want to ever blame teachers because they come into a system. But even when you come into a system and you're being judged by covering material and how well kids do on tests, there's still opportunities for doing things differently that I think that some teachers see and many others fail to see.
through our partnership with Center Edge, like just the valuable resources that are out there. But the corollary doesn't exist in the system that teachers are rewarded for many of the kinds of things with, particular, with the exception of particular schools. But that notion, so I'm wondering if the question of sustainability here needs to be changing the systems of rewards, but also the assessments themselves. If you're going to be promoted on whether or not your kids, get to that next level, it doesn't matter if you found that right assessment to be creative or that you're recognizing their humanity, when you can't see in a short period of time when you have them for a semester, a year, that they're going to benefit from that. So how do we start to change the bigger system in your mind?
So, I mean, I think it's also Brandisha's question. It's the tyranny of the test, which the policymakers set, which then reinforces what we're doing. How do we challenge that? And I think that's a challenge for all of us to think about. It's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So we did a study on black children in LA a few years ago, and trying to understand why, even as the black population declines, black children are doing so poorly on every indicator. And what's clear when you start looking at it is the accumulation of disadvantages both in school and outside of school. Then we flip the question, where are we seeing black children excelling in LA? And what's different about those places? And one of the schools we find is King Drew Science Magnet in Watts, right? And then we start to look at what's different. Everything is different. They're in an enriched learning environment. They're stimulated. They're mentored. They're supported. They're attached to a hospital, so they have a career pathway. They send more students to the University of California, black students, than any other school in the state. My question is, why is there only one school like that? Why isn't there many schools like that? And why aren't schools that are struggling learning from schools like this? So part of what we've got to do, and I've been saying this to policymakers, but I think we have to keep saying and keep challenging, is that if you keep, it's as if they expect different results following the same script. Why? Maybe we need to change the script and try things a little differently. And so I haven't figured out the answer to what will get through to the politicians, Democrat or Republican for that matter, right? Because the truth is, Obama's policies in education look a lot like George Bush's policies, right? I think Democrats and Republicans are kind of stuck. And how we unstick it is, I think, one of the big questions for us.
From online that I think is interesting. So Christina Lee asks, I am working to disrupt the way we teach pedagogy in the School of Ed where I work, and I'm coming up against the same resistance I faced when I was working as a high school teacher in South LA, which is essentially resistance to change. What advice do you have to transform systems that are so used to doing business as usual?
Unfortunately, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. You would think, especially in systems that have been failing for so long, that they'd be open to something new and different. I give an example. I was working with Pittsburgh schools, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Westinghouse High School. It's a school, population shrinking, all black, all low income. Just a terrible school in every way. Like, it's the kind of school you want to avoid. I go to the cosmetology lab. It's amazing. The kids are like totally engaged. They're learning something practical. They never miss the class. They might miss other class. And the woman who's teaching the class is totally in charge. It's an apprenticeship model. So you have teachers come down and get their hair done, right? Because they know they're good and she's well trained. I tried to tell the principal, I said, you need to learn from this. Because this is the solution to your school. And she can't see it. That's the problem. Is a lot of times, if you've been so schooled in a system that leads you to think it can only be done one way, that it's hard to think outside the box. But I think that's the work, is to challenge the box that people have let themselves be put in.
So,
Mike.
thank you so much. Now, my question is, when you're working with resistance, right, and from different positions, how do you influence the community to move faster? Because I've been in communities where it's accepted and communities where it's not accepted, different ideas, different innovation, and then they say, like, this is the status quo, this is what we do here, we don't do that here. Because I've been over at 100 schools, so I got an opportunity to see a lot of different educators. So my thing is that I can get people to listen, I can get students to listen, but when you have resistance and when somebody wants what you have, as far as like that control of the environment, right, and people listening, how can, because I always try to empower the principal or anybody around it, but I'm trying to figure out, like, the other staff, you know, other teachers might, I've seen somebody pour water on a teacher's head, right? Teacher said something inappropriate to the student, it wasn't feeling good, was having a bad day, this one pour some on their head, like, for real, like, right? But that person said something that she didn't know that she said to that student that was not nice, about 15, 16-year-old. They're not playing that. Young lady ain't playing that, being real. So the teacher, the woman said something to her on a bad day and got some poured on her head. And then all the students in that class saw that too as well. So now the backlash of that, and then now she is feeling abused, and then that student is still feeling abused from what the teacher said to her. So it's like what you just said with the hair, that's a good thing because now you can talk about that in the literature way, right? How did you do that, write about it, and break that down? Because you could tie tests in there too as well in your writing skills about cosmetology. You could talk about, let's write about it, let's make a magazine about it too. So it's like going to that step, but seeing and getting people to see. So I'm like trying to figure out, do we need to have more like team building days with the staff, right? Or do we need to have like parents, like if parents are working and all this? So it's a whole bunch of arbitrage that we have to talk about. And it just makes me think, and then you just put that thought, and then they put the thought and questions, and like, yeah.
So disrupting dysfunctional systems, not easy. I know because I've been working at it for a long time. It's not easy because once you're in that system, it starts to get normalized. And you see people do things, treat each other in ways that make no sense. You know, suspending kids for not coming to school. Right? Think about the logic there, right? And you see this over and over again. So the only thing I've seen that starts to work is when you can create a sense of dissonance about possibilities. You know, so I'm in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, home to the University of Alabama, great football team, school named after the coach, Bear Bryant, all black school, all white teaching staff. They're invited to talk to the teachers. And all they're telling me is how bad these kids are. Nothing I say is getting through. And I said, how many of you have ever been to a school where black children excel? No one raised their hand. I said, you know, those schools exist. They said, really? I said, yeah, they do. I said, so I challenged them. I said, come with me to New York. I'll take you to some schools like that. They sent 8 teachers. One of the schools I took them to is Medgar Evers Prep in Brooklyn. And they were blown away. They were blown away not just because of what they saw the kids doing and listening to the kids talk about their education and what they were going to do with it. They were blown away because they started to realize, and this is really troubling, the problem is not the kids. The problem is the way they treat those kids. That kind of now is that enough to get them to go back and do it differently? I'm not sure. But I think it starts there by disrupting the thinking about what's going on. So, you know, how do we do that at scale, right? Because, you know, schools are like factories. They're like machines. They just keep churning. They're places where people work, important to the economy, but they're reproducing the very problem we say we're trying to solve. And, you know, I haven't given up on the hope that maybe we could do it differently. Jerry?
How do you get parents to demand change?
I think similarly, that when parents know, see, because right now what happens, when parents get fed up, they just leave. They say, I'm out. I'll homeschool. I'll find something better someplace else. And that's understandable because it's your child and, you know, you don't know what. But that doesn't change the system. It might change the reality for your child, but it doesn't change it for the other children. The only thing I've seen, and we did this when I did this work in Berkeley, it was when we educated parents about what was happening to their kids, and they organized, that they then demanded change. Right? And that led to change, many changes at the school. But they had to have information of what to know they were entitled to and what was wrong. Because they knew something was wrong, but they didn't know exactly what it was. And just, that just breeds frustration. And it's just like navigating the healthcare system. If we navigate it as individuals, we know we're not getting treated right, but we don't know what to do about it. But guess what? We're not the only ones. There's millions of us like that, right? And the same thing is true in schools. But you have to have a sense of what could be different in order to demand something different. So.
There's one more online question.
Thank you, Australia.
Okay, perfect. So the online question is, with the system fighting back, especially in states like Florida and Texas, how do we teachers not only survive in such an environment, but thrive in order to disrupt the status quo? And to empower our students, no matter who they are, especially those targeted for scapegoating?
So I don't want to pretend that this is easy, especially right now in this political climate, but I have been talking to educators in Texas and Florida who realize if they don't want to just quit and leave and move, then they're going to need allies. And your best allies are your students and their parents. Right? And where that's happening, their parents are mobilizing. There's a counter-mobilization taking place about what children have a right to learn. Right? And that the politicians can't just ban kids from learning history, for example. So there is a pushback, but it's when people get organized around their rights to an education. Without that, then it's really, we're in trouble. So thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you, Corey, for being here. And 2 more classes coming up. See you soon.